All right, Larry Johnson, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
Jay, thanks for having me. I guess arranged through our mutual friend Matt.
Well, I'm very glad to have you on. I think, like a great many people, I became aware of your work through the work of Judge Napolitano.
Right.
But I'm curious, for those who aren't familiar with what you do, how did you get started producing the kind of content you do?
Uh, I've always been, I guess, sort of an outlier. My life has been like a jazz player doing improvisation. So the My background were, I did 4 years with the CIA, 85 to 89, then left the CIA where I had been undercover at the CIA. My cover was that I was a State Department officer. And then I actually moved to State Department, worked in the Office of Counterterrorism for 4 years. Then I got out and started doing a consulting job that primarily focused, I did financial investigations, investigating money laundering, product counterfeiting around the world. Uh, we ran a civil RICO case, racketeering case against the tobacco companies for money laundering drug proceeds. And then also, I scripted terrorism exercises for the U.S. military special operations forces. So all of that as background it really gave me a broad insight into how U.S. government policy is made. I saw it soup to nuts. A lot of people who go through their government careers, they're in a pipeline. They call it being stovepiped. You work only FBI, or you work only CIA operations, or you work only within the military. But I was cross all those boundaries. I was in with the FBI. I was in with CIA operations as well as the analytical side of the house. I certainly was up to my elbows for 23, 24 years working with SEAL Team 6 and Delta Force and other black top secret military special operations units. And I got while I was doing this, I'd left State Department in 1994. Carlos the Jackal was captured. And I got a call from the guy who'd been our press guy in the counterterrorism office of state. And his brother was a booker on CNN. And he goes, "Hey, my brother's looking for somebody to come on and talk about the capture of Carlos the Jackal." And said, "Dan, could you do it?" I said, "Yeah, sure. Have mouth, we'll travel." And so I went on and did this. That was my first TV appearance as a talking head. And, I got the reputation for giving good sound bite. So I could do the sound bite quickly, punchy, pithy, and it could also be entertaining. And then that launched for a while anyway, a career as I was a pretty ubiquitous on the cable news shows. I was the NBC terrorism analyst going into Y2K in 2000. Um, I was being interviewed by Katie Couric the moment that the plane hit the Pentagon on the morning of 9/11. But then the Barack Obama era arrived, and because I was critical of Barack Obama, that's when the media started shutting down and turning people off. And so I was shunned by television, which that's such is life. And then I started doing a lot more on the internet, writing a blog. And it's just been over the last 2 or 3 years that, being interviewed on podcasts, that's sort of taken off because I've got a unique experience and insight that the 99% of Americans don't have. And I can sort of tell them what's behind the curtain, how this stuff really works, and can, call bullshit when the bullshit's pretty deep.
So this is not at all what I brought you on to talk about, but nonetheless, I'm interested to ask you: how have you seen the the public facing image of those agencies you've worked for change from when you started working there to now?
They become total political whores, is the kindest way I could describe it. Look, I started at CIA in 1985 and left in '89, and towards the end of my first year there, the first year was an orientation. It was in what was called the career trainee program. But I went through the new analyst course, and my instructor was a man by the name of George Allen. Now, this is not the George Allen of NFL football history. This George Allen was the senior manager. He was the guy in charge of all analysis during the Vietnam War. And George was telling us about how much political pressure he came under as an analyst. He was getting phone calls from Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was then president, from McGeorge Bundy, who was the national security advisor to Johnson, from Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense. So they're calling up this senior manager at CIA saying, hey, why aren't you being a team player? Why aren't you telling the story we want told? So that was sort of my introduction. What we've seen develop over the last 20 years has become these agencies, both the CIA and the FBI, have become so highly politicized. The FBI they didn't take sides. They didn't play one, for one team or the other. They were like they were a pretty fair umpire. Man, they lost that big time going starting into the 2000s, and they became a weapon when Donald Trump was a candidate. Same thing with CIA. I know for a fact from one of my former colleagues, a friend, that the CIA set up a specific unit in the Central Intelligence Agency in the summer of 2015 to collect intelligence that could be used against prospective presidential candidates. They were collecting at the time because it wasn't clear who was going to be the Republican nominee. So they were collecting information on Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, and I forget who else was running back then, as well as they were collecting even on Jeb Bush. But they were also collecting on Bernie Sanders, because this effort that was set up by John Brennan, I'm told, was at the behest of Hillary Clinton. And so they were, no holds barred. And then after that, the full power of the CIA was unleashed with trying to portray Trump as a stooge of the Russians. So we've seen this corrupting power of these three-letter agencies, particularly CIA and FBI. I mean, if I was, Donald Trump brought me in and said, okay, what do we do with these? Burn them to the ground, start over. They're so corrupted institutionally, they have to be dismantled, and you start over from scratch.
I think it's interesting you draw attention, earlier speaking about your career, about the Obama era, because it's almost odd to me how much Obama has kind of faded into the woodwork. Despite being this kind of massive celebrity. I mean, you still see him, right? He still promotes books and the like. But to me, I feel like he's almost under discussed by people, especially my age, on the younger side of things. Because I think there's a perspective at which, there's a chance that we could have gone back to being a normal country. We could have gone back to having, and I realize this term has gotten kind of a negative connotation, but really we could have had norms again. And the politicization both of the media, which had always been political, but became even more so, right? Particularly around, BLM, other things like that. But then also when we're speaking about the weaponization of agencies, what it reminds me of is when he basically sent the IRS after the Tea Party.
Right.
And admittedly, that's maybe a discussion for another day, but that sort of, desire is to basically, mortgage the future of the country to win an immediate political battle. I mean, on one hand, that's human nature. On the other hand, that trend got worse and worse. Going through the Trump years, I think that's really when I started to notice it. Because before a certain year, it kind of seemed like, the FBI and the CIA were, it was roughly as political as, the Coast Guard, right? You hear about them, they do something,
right?
But they're not mentioned in the same phrase. Like, no one cares what the Coast Guard thinks about who's going to be elected president, right? It's just not even a conversation. But particularly through that, and I want to bring this back to the kind of central canard of that investigation into Trump, which is the idea that Trump is a Russian asset. I mean, you even still see it bouncing around now, 8 years later. So, in your mind, how much of that was good faith, and how much of that was effectively any way we can get rid of Trump? I guess we've just settled on Russia.
Oh, it was entirely any way we can get Trump. I mean, this really was a massive intelligence operation, and I've been impressed with John Brennan's ability to pretend that he didn't know nothing about birth of no babies. You know, he had no idea that that the FBI was so out of control. I mean, that's just a damnable lie. So in December of 2015, there was a Democratic political operative by the name of Badowski, and he was doing text messages with John Podesta. We know this thanks to Julian Assange, because those emails were leaked to WikiLeaks, and as Assange put them out. And Badowski it was Podesta were talking about that they needed to turn Trump into Putin's boyfriend, basically. That was their strategy. So you look back at how this whole operation unfolded. You know, this kid Papadopoulos, who gets tabbed as a Trump foreign policy advisor, which was an idiotic decision on Trump's part. But the only reason how did they get up on Papadopoulos? Most people and pundits haven't even paid attention. Well, how did that happen? Well, how it happened was Papadopoulos was in England. He was calling back on his cell phone and talking with Corey Lewandowski, who at the time was Trump's campaign manager. They communicated. Guess what? Conversations were intercepted. Who intercepted those conversations? Because NSA is not allowed to intercept the conversation between American citizen Lewandowski and American citizen Papadopoulos. Oh, that would be our British cousins. We celebrated kicking their ass out of the country yesterday. But the Brits collected that as intelligence. But then they could pass it to the American side as liaison reporting. And the Americans are thinking, oh my God, we didn't collect this, wink, nod. And then that information was passed on to the FBI. Well, so an elaborate sting was set up to, one, offer a job to Papadopoulos that he wasn't qualified for. And, Peel, he gets to become vice president, such and such of this think tank that turns out has direct ties to MI6. And then, his conversations, he's introduced by another intelligence asset who sets him up and then introduces him, quote, to Putin's niece. And Putin doesn't even have a niece. But, Papadopoulos, he was, too young and inexperienced. He didn't know that. And then gets introduced to this Australian diplomat who also had close ties with intelligence. And that diplomat waits 2 months after his supposed conversation with Papadopoulos to inform the FBI, oh my God, he said that he's got information that Trump's working with Putin. I mean, this entire setup, it was orchestrated and it involved both CIA and FBI and British intelligence. So Trump didn't stand a chance. I mean, he didn't really know what he was up against.
I think that this is, and obviously it's difficult, right? Because at any sort of kind of dissident politics, people are kind of hopping on the train at different points. So some of the things I say may sound a little bit naive, but if it makes you feel any better, I'm in my early 20s, right? I was probably in grade school when other relevant examples happened.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I noticed very quickly about Russiagate, and I didn't bring you on to discuss Russiagate, but I thought it was relevant to bring up, is that effectively the holes started to show very, very quickly.
Right.
that it was very clear that this was a narrative people wanted to have around. It was particularly convenient, right, to explain the kind of electoral successes Trump made. And in a broader sense, it ties into a long running antipathy towards Russia. So, what is the genesis of this hatred for Russia? You'd think, after the fall of the Soviet Union, we did it, we beat communism. All right, Russia can go back to being a normal country. We don't hate Germany anymore, right? So clearly this can be done. Why does the US empire seem to have it out for Russia? Why are they always the bad guy?
That's a great question, Jay. And it's founded, not your question, but the American attitude is founded in complete irrational thought and behavior. Think back. Apart from France, Russia played a fairly important role in helping America secure its independence from British colonial rule in the 1776 to 1783, because it blocked British efforts to try to enlist. They actually tried to convince the Russians to send soldiers to fight in the colonies. And Russia and Catherine the Great said, hell no. And then there was a pretty extensive trade between the United States and Russia then. Then again, in the Civil War, the Russians intervened in a way that they put some of their naval ships in New York Harbor as a sign, as a warning to the Brits, keep your hands off. Because at the time, the Brits were actively entertaining the thoughts of, hey, let's back the South and see if we can defeat the North. So we've got this, what I'd call a historical foundation for friendship with Russia. And it was, though, with the fall of the Tsar, the rise of the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks in the revolution in 1917, that all coincided with this tremendous fear in the West, in particular in America, about foreign subversion, communism, anarchy. And part of it was we were in the process of becoming, let's call it, an abusive capitalist state. We sort of had this unfettered capitalism, though, that was really taking advantage of workers. It was no coincidence that you experienced the efforts of the socialists to organize and workers' organizations back in the early 1900s, because the United States was bent on this approach that it was capitalism without a heart. And so that's, I think, where the initial fear of the Soviets really became embedded. And then the really, it's sort of contradictory. On the one hand, the Soviet communist movement was associated with being Jews. So it was seen as part of this international Jewish conspiracy. And yet, Jews comprised a very, very small percentage of particularly the Stalinist rule. And in fact, it was Stalin who was actively engaged with a project to rule out, to take on the Trotskyites, who were these rabid Bolsheviks, and a lot of them were Jews. So, this is where anti-Semitism and anti-communism get wrapped up in the American fervor. But as you point out, 1991, Soviet Union goes away. And what's left is a Russia which returns to its religious roots in Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And so I tell you, I think right now what really pisses us off are two things. Russia, Vladimir Putin called in all the oligarchs about 2000, 2001, sat them down and said, okay, party's over. You're going to stop raping our country and sending all the profits and proceeds overseas to these foreigners, these other oligarchs that we call capitalists in the West. And you're going to keep it here at home, and you're going to get out of politics. You can make as much money as you want, just stay out of politics. And if you don't, I'm putting you in jail. Well, he did that. And most of the oligarchs went along with it. Some didn't. Khodorkovsky was one who didn't. He wound up in prison. And I know for a fact, because in, was it 2001, I was hired by a Washington, D.C. lobbying firm that had a contract with Khodorkovsky, because he had just been locked up and they were looking for some information, and they got a hold of me to see if I could tap into CIA sources. So, I saw firsthand how the thing was working on the Washington, D.C. side. The other thing is the return of the Russians to their traditional religious family values. They are adamant opponents of homosexuality and the whole LGBTQ movement. They think it's weird. They think it's a deviant behavior. If you are homosexual, they're not going to string you up in the middle of the street in Moscow. Whatever you do in the privacy of your home or bedroom, that's your business. However, if you're going to bring it to the streets, if you're going to insist on having Pride Month, but only have one day for Mother's Day, man, you're in the wrong place. And it's not just Putin; it's the Russian society shares that attitude. Oh my God, that really pisses off the West, particularly the media companies in Hollywood, because how dare the Russians not embrace transgenderism's the other thing that's come up, and the Russians are just adamant against it. So it's a cultural difference too.
I think that's a very, very comprehensive answer. So I brought you on to discuss 3 specific events that I believe have a through line, both to the conversation you and I have just had,
Right.
and then kind of one in one sequence together. And so that is specifically 3, shall we say, mysterious attacks that have happened in Russia. An attack at a concert hall, right, which we can get into, situation in Dagestan, and then most recently, a cluster bomb strike on a beach at Sevastopol. So I'm curious. Let's start with the concert hall attack and go from there.
Sure.
So what is, shall we say, the New York Times official version of that story? And then how does that differ from what you think happened?
Yeah, so the New York Times story is that, oh my God, the United States warned Russia that there was going to be a terrorist attack, and the Russians ignored the warning, and oh my God, it's all the Russians' fault. Okay? That's it in a nutshell. Well, again, when I saw what was going on, I had firsthand information about this by virtue of my previous experience. When I was at the State Department Office of Counterterrorism, I joined there in October of 1989. This was 1 year after the bombing of Panem 103. And at the time of the bombing of Panem 103, there was a widespread belief amongst the press and amongst the American people that the CIA knew about the bombing, that the State Department, that we had advanced knowledge, and we just didn't tell people. We told some people, don't get on the plane, but we let other people go to their death. Well, that was a lie. It was not true. But that belief was out there. So when we started, the question always came up, if you've got warnings, if you've got intelligence information about an impending terrorist attack, if you can't stop it, you've got to issue a public warning. Now, what does this have to do with Crocus? Well, a week before the Crocus attacks, Embassy Moscow put out a warning to the American community, and it was like on a Friday, and they basically said, "Oh, hey, Americans, don't go to any concerts, stay away from public places, because there's likely to be a terrorist attack in the next 3 days." Now, you got to understand that embassy didn't initiate that warning on its own. It did it because the State Department, Blinkenshop, directed them to do it. And probably my old outfit, now it's called the Bureau of Counterterrorism, was the impetus behind issuing that warning. But what was odd about it is it tied it only to like 3 days. So it didn't say, we've got information that we're not sure when the attack will take place, but we know it could take place sometime in the future. Okay, so the weekend comes and goes, no attack. So the embassy does not issue the warning again. 4 days pass, 5 days, and then the Crocus City Center is attacked like the following Saturday or Sunday. And then, the official government response that was reported in the New York Times on the U.S. side, oh, we warned the Russians, they just ignored us. Well, I call bullshit on that, because if they were in fact still saying that threat was active, then they should have come back out and warned American citizens again that the threat was active and had not ended. They didn't do that. So right away, you knew, what, the United States had some advanced knowledge of this. And it wasn't just because they had some nifty intelligence collection. They may have actually been involved with the planning of it or the financing of it, or were witting of British planning and financing of the operation. But it was not a matter of, intrepid intelligence sources coming forward and saying, hey, we think something bad's going to happen in Russia. So that was the first start. And then, this was the direct provocation. But let's face it, that wasn't, for the previous 10 years through CIA involvement in Ukraine, there have been consistent attacks launched in the Donbass and some into Belgorod in Russia against civilians. So the attack against civilians thing wasn't new. And a year before, it was actually, I guess, so Crocus was this year. So actually about a year ago last week was when Yevgeny Prigozhin, again, he was recruited by CIA, British MI6, as they thought they had recruited him to carry out an attempted coup. I believe that the SVR penetrated that plot, and they used Prigozhin as a dangle, as a bait to try to smoke out other Western efforts to destabilize Russia. So, but what we're looking at in Crocus was definitely a Western-backed intelligence operation carried out by the Ukrainians with enough plausible deniability that the West could claim, oh my God, we tried to warn those Russians, they just didn't listen to us.
Excuse me, I was muted. That's one of the most interesting things about the timeline of events, right? Is very, very quickly after the attack. I believe that the attackers had scarcely left the building.
Yeah, well, they're still inside the building. Actually, they're still inside.
And then the U.S. government had said, we believe we found out exactly who it is. It's ISIS-K.
Yeah,
correct. Was who they blamed for it. And look, I'm no expert, but traditionally you're supposed to wait a little longer than that. It's almost more suspicious if the attack isn't even done yet.
Well, AJ, look, as a kid growing up, did you ever play the game Clue?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. So that's like you walk in and you sit down at the board and you goes, yeah, it's Colonel Mustard in the library with a revolver.
Exactly. They're like, all right, yeah, we know who cheated. Yeah.
Yeah. Dude, how'd you do that? I mean, we know you're smart, but are you really that smart?
Yeah, I think that, and there are several odd things. There are several odd things about that. So one of the things that someone might say, and I would view this as a little bit naive, but they would say we would never do such a thing. We would never use terrorism to attack a country we're not at war with. How would you respond to that hypothetical person?
Well, sorry to keep using profanity, but I'd say bullshit. So let's go back and look at the history of the United States and overthrowing democratically elected governments. We overthrew the government of Mossadegh in Iran, 1954, because, the oil companies were not happy that he was going to nationalize the oil and use it for the benefit of the Iranian people. By God, we couldn't allow that to go on. Similarly, we got rid of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala about the same time. Back in 1999, the United States started working with some of the Islamic extremists in Chechnya and basically helped finance what was a terrorist war that was carried out against the Russians for 10 years until the Russians, under Putin, defeated it. but that went on for about 10 years. Um, we were actively arming and financing a variety of what we now call terrorist groups, but then we called them mujahideen, holy warriors in Afghanistan from the time that the Soviets invaded in 1979 until they left in roughly 1989. The United States, we have a history. Not just as another example. You remember that terrorist group Hezbollah, who is
Yes.
backed by that terrorist state Iran?
Yes.
So, 1981, CIA goes into Ronald Reagan with the Israelis and asks permission to arm the Iranians because from the Israeli standpoint, they saw the Iranians as a potential ally they could use against then Saddam Hussein, who they feared was building a nuclear weapon. And so Ronald Reagan signed off on it. So starting from 1981 up and through the Iran-Contra affair that got exposed in '86, and but up really through 1987, United States was funding and providing weapons to the government of Iran and indirectly to Hezbollah. And in April of 1983, Hezbollah operatives detonated a car bomb in the Marine barracks in Beirut, Lebanon, in response to the fact that the U.S. Navy was shelling the families of those Hezbollah folks out in the Bekaa Valley. So it was retaliation for that. But my point is, the United States does not have, we've dealt with every scumbag in the world, willingly so, knowingly so. And then at the same time that we were arming Iran, we were also arming Iraq with the elements that they used to make chemical weapons that they were using to attack Iran with. You've got pictures of Don Rumsfeld glad handing with Saddam Hussein during that period. So we played a double game all along. I mean, God, we kept Manny Noriega on the Perry roll, even though we knew he was a degenerate drug guy. But hey, why get caught up with facts? So yeah, would we get in bed and tolerate terrorists? Absolutely.
So the last of the three attacks, the cluster bomb strike, is different from the other two, right? It is
Right.
not directly terrorist related. But do you want to go over the details of that and why that why that represents an escalation in this conflict?
Yeah. So this is these ATACMS missiles were given to the Ukrainians, but they weren't the most modern, the latest version. They are actually an older version because that's why they have the cluster munitions on them. And so that everybody understands what a cluster munition is. Imagine a telephone pole, small telephone pole with 200 softballs glued to it. But those softballs are explosive. And so if you can fire that telephone pole off of a catapult, then at some point all those softballs come loose, they scatter out on the ground, and they explode. That's essentially what this ATACMS missile was. It was fired, and the target it was fired at was actually north of the beach. So the fact that this one missile passed the target it probably should have hit, headed towards the beach, and I think it's pretty clear now that the Russians actually were able to either partially shoot it down or interfere with it with electronic warfare measures, but it still didn't completely disable it. And the thing opened up and did a dispersal of some of those cluster munitions. Some fell and exploded. They killed 3 or 4 people, I believe, at least 2 children. And it wounded 150 others. Some of it's just the debris falling down, hitting people. Now, they said, well, that's not the fault of the United States. Oh, really? So I'm a firearms instructor. And one of the things we teach with firearms is if you got a gun, you're responsible for that gun. And if you got kids running around your house, you absolutely do not leave that gun out where those kids can get a hold of it and hurt themselves or someone else. Well, in this case, just like that mother in Chesapeake, Virginia, who somehow let her 6-year-old son get a loaded handgun, take the gun to school, and shoot a teacher. Now, she was criminally responsible. She is as responsible as that kid for shooting the teacher. And so here's what we did with Ukraine. We gave Ukraine the equivalent of a loaded gun. We said, here's the loaded gun. We didn't tell them, keep this gun at home, don't take it out, don't go shoot the teacher. In fact, for them to go out and shoot the gun, we had to give them some intelligence that had been collected from our ISR platforms, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platforms, which means a drone or a KC-135 that's dressed up and called a rivet joint. And we give that information, and that information is inputted into the actual warhead, the guidance system, so that it can go down range. So maybe we didn't tell the Ukrainians to fire at that date, at that time. Here, now press the trigger. But we certainly enabled everything else. And if this was a case of, a teacher getting shot with a gun at school, we'd be held criminally liable in this country. That's why the United States is criminally liable in this case. It's a war crime.
So how has the Kremlin reacted to this strike at this beach?
Really pissed off. Now, and what's interesting is that we've had terrorists. We've had multiple terrorist attacks, including Crocus, and then the attacks in Belgorod with other HIMARS and some ATACMS over the last year and a half. But this one really set the Russians off because it was on Pentecost Sunday. And again, they are a devout Eastern Orthodox Christian nation now. And the attack on children, kids, beachgoers. I used the analogy, and it got picked up by a lot of people, including like the Aussie, the Cossack, and Marjorie Taylor Greene. I said, just imagine what would happen if we got into a war, a real war with the drug cartel in Mexico, with the Sinaloa cartel or the Norte de Valle, and that Russia equipped them with some short-range ballistic missiles. And those ballistic missiles got fired at Homestead Air Force Base, which is the headquarters of Southcom, SOC South, Special Operations Command, Southern Command. And that, our air defense deflected it, and it went over, exploded on a beach in Miami. Would we care whether or not the Russians really directed the Mexicans to do that? Hell no. We'd be outraged. Well, Russians were outraged. And what happened was within a couple of days, Putin announced basically we're going to give instructions that our military is going to shoot down drones. Lloyd Austin got on the phone. They called in the U.S. ambassador. Lynn Tracy is her name in Moscow. Read her the riot act. I guess she, after that talking to, she had to go seek a change of underwear because it was a stern talking to. And then the next day, Lloyd Austin picks the phone up and calls his counterpart, Belousov, the new defense minister in Russia. And the Pentagon doesn't give much of a readout, but we found out what Belousov said. And Belousov told him, from now on, any of your drones that fly into the Black Sea, we're taking them down. They're going to be shot down. Didn't clarify what they do about the fixed-wing aircraft that have personnel on board, but I suspect they're going to intercept those. So what the United States do after that, we stop flying drones into the Black Sea. So the Russians made it very clear, we're going to retaliate. The other thing that Putin says, okay, you want to play this game? You want to put ATACMS into the hands of the Ukrainians? Great. We got a bunch of missiles that we can put that are far more effective than your ATACMS, that we can put in the hands of Hezbollah. We can put it in the hands of the Houthis. We can put it in the hands of the Iranians. Anywhere in the world that you in the United States have got a beef with somebody, we can arm those folks up, and maybe even drug cartels. They could arm them up. You want to play that game? Two can play it. That's the message that came across.
So where do you view the current state of the Russia Ukraine war as it regards America and the American empire? Because one of the notable things is that the Ukraine war has faded from the sort of news that normal people interact with.
Sure.
In
Well,
addition to that, and sorry, I just want to
no,
finish
go
this
ahead.
thought because it seems like at the very first, the news was incredibly triumphant. The early months of the war, the Russians are getting demolished, and then every time we heard, kind of in the mainstream news, it's, well, they're still winning, but we need more money.
Mm-hmm.
And now the updates have gotten fewer and fewer and fewer, and the praise is a little bit less effusive. And I follow this issue a little bit closer than the average man, but it's certainly not my kind of main beat.
Yeah.
So does it seem like Ukraine is losing support from the West? If so, why? And how long do you think they can hold out?
Well, let me suggest this parallel. Ukraine is the geopolitical equivalent of Joe Biden. So for 3.5 years, the media has been gaslighting everybody about Joe Biden being, my God, he can't go. They won't let him on Jeopardy because he's too damn smart. He'd beat everybody, and he's just sharp as a tack. His mental acuity is second to none. He is the golden tongue orator that he would have held the Greeks spellbound. Okay. So Americans get fed that bullshit for about 3.5 years. And then last Thursday night, the wheels come off and they go, oh my God, this guy's got degenerative mental disease, probably Parkinson's dementia, but, without going into the specific diagnosis, but there's no way he can be in charge of the country. He can't even speak a coherent sentence. Well, we've done the same thing with Ukraine, as you pointed out. Oh man, Ukraine is killing those Russians right and left. They got, was it 500,000 or a million Russians dead? Oh, they're killing them all. They've destroyed the Black Sea Fleet. They've shot down every Russian plane. They are conquering every Russian army. Russians left with having to scrape the bottom of the barrel to get the kids who are in the orphans home for the retarded. They're having to recruit them to take to the front lines because they can't get any more soldiers. Now that was the story for the last 2.5 years. Now they're going, okay. Actually, it's just the opposite. They couldn't hide it anymore last week when Zelensky himself, being interviewed, went on television and said, "We don't have much time." I'm quoting, "We don't have much time. We have all these wounded and dead on the battlefield." So, Russia has inflicted upwards of 600,000 killed, KIA, probably close to 2 million wounded in action. Ukraine no longer has any kind of effective air defense. Most of its air force has been shot down or is grounded because they can't take off for fear of being shot down. They limited artillery supply. Their manpower is, they're losing right now on average about 2,000 casualties a day, which is on pace to be what the Germans lost at Stalingrad over a 6-month period. Horrific casualty amount. When you just put that in context, the Ukrainians are losing in 2 days all of the casualties that we suffered in Iraq over a 15-year time period. Okay, just to put it in perspective. The Russians now have, by contrast, they're signing up recruits. They come in and sign contracts to go to the front to fight at the rate of 35,000 a month. Last year it was 42,000 a month. They added almost 500,000 soldiers to the ranks. These guys get signed up. They actually get a full 6 to 7 months of training, 3 months basic, and then 4 months of advanced individual training. Whereas the Ukrainians, they got press gangs going out on the street, literally grabbing people who are out, walking to go get ice cream or go pick up the morning paper, grabbing these guys, stuffing them in vans, taking them to some remote headquarters, putting uniforms on them, throwing a gun in their hands, and then sending them to the front with no training. And surprisingly, a lot of these guys get there and they do the Monty Python thing. They run away, surrender to the Russians if they don't get killed first. So the war, Ukraine is the equivalent of a guy that's just been told he's got stage 4 liver cancer. It's metastasized to all parts of his body. You may have a month to live. You may have 6 months to live, but you're going to die. Ukraine's going to die.
So there's a friend of mine who has a theory on this that I think is quite convincing, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it. His argument is effectively that the U.S. empire has gotten exactly what they wanted out of the Ukraine war. They don't really care about Ukraine. They're fine, consigning that whole people basically to a civilizational collapse. But what this has done is several things. Primarily, it has broken the ties between Europe and Russia as far as it regards energy, right? The Nord Stream pipeline, just what are the chances? Random accident. It no longer is there, right? Just amazing how that works.
Yeah.
Right. All of these countries have had to largely deindustrialize because they have to get their energy from us. Much of these companies are being onshored onto the US. So that's the primary goal. Also, it has, to at least some degree, cost Russia, right? Not maybe as dearly as we thought, but they've had to expend treasure. And then on the other end, it's basically functioned as a replacement for the kind of war of the day, right? The current way for the U.S. political system to funnel money into the MIC. Now, I'm not saying every one of these things has gone exactly according to plan, right? But
Yeah.
From their perspective, is Ukraine losing a problem?
Oh, in fact, it's a huge problem. What has happened here? I think your friend's premise may actually have been some of the thinking of the United States at the outset, but we have now not only shot ourselves in the foot. There's also on YouTube, sometimes you can watch these idiots where they put a loaded pistol against their genitals and show how they can almost break the trigger, and inevitably they shoot themselves in the crotch. The United States has shot itself in the crotch. And let me explain. Early on, we thought that, we had built up the Ukrainian military to such a level that it would defeat the Russians, that it would actually present such a credible military threat to Russia that Ukraine could fight a proxy war for us, weaken the Russians. And that if Russia dared to respond in any way, because we kept pushing it. We kept pushing forces to expand NATO. We were continuing to arm and equip the Ukrainian army for a new offensive that was going to take place in the Donbass. And so we provoked Russia into this, but we thought, if they respond, we're going to hit them with sanctions that's going to cripple their economy. And we'll start that off by cutting them off from SWIFT. And SWIFT, as you may know, is basically it's a interbank email system based out of Brussels, I believe. But it's U.S. controlled. That if you're going to do any kind of wire transfer between a bank, it's got to be done through the SWIFT system. And what most people who were advocating this, let's cut Russia off from SWIFT, what they didn't understand is that the intelligence community collected the hell out of that information and therefore was able actually to get a lot of intelligence about who was moving money where. It was terrific in doing money laundering cases. So the United States imposes those sanctions. Well, what happens? Russia, after initially going, what? Wakes up, accelerates its work to develop BRICS, the alternative economic system it's trying to put together with China, India, South Africa, and Brazil, as well as it then starts ramping up its defense industry. Because unlike the United States, Russia has kept its defense industry intact, and it was just a matter of expanding, putting new workers in, reactivating some factories. The United States has actually shipped most of its overseas. So it's deindustrialized in a way over the last 50 years that would have been unimaginable at the end of World War II. So now all of a sudden, here's the United States thinking, okay, we got those Russians right where we want them, except Russia is now producing 6 to 7 times the number of 155 millimeter artillery shells. And the United States can't even keep pace with the rate at which the Ukrainians were using those shells up. The U.S. air defense systems, Patriots, whatever, have been exposed as ineffective. They've been destroyed, and they failed to stop the Russian missiles, despite repeated reports from Ukrainian press sources to the contrary. Every single what they call the Wunderwaffen, the wonder weapon that's going to change the war in Ukraine in favor of those Ukrainians, has failed. First, it was the Javelin. Then it was the HIMARS. Then it was the M777, or maybe it was M777 before the HIMARS, which is a howitzer firing the 152 millimeter. Then oh my God, we're going to put those Bradley fighting vehicles in. That'll change the day. Yeah, they get blown up. M1 Abrams tanks, blown up. Now our next sacrifice on the altar of war in Ukraine will be the F-16. And, the bookies in London should be taking bets on, how long those survive. You might be able to make some money on that. So, here's Russia now, militarily stronger. And oh, yeah, when the war started, Russia had about 720,000 active duty soldiers. The United States had 472,000 active duty soldiers. Here we are 2.5 years later. Russia's active duty soldiers is now 1.3, approaching 1.4 million. The United States is down to 452,000. So whether we're talking military strength, military production, effectiveness of combat aircraft, air defense systems, that's the other thing. Russia's got the most advanced air defense systems in the world, outpacing anything the United States has. So here's the United States thinking, oh boy, we got these Russians right where we want them. And now in the space of 2 years, Russia went from the 6th largest global economy measured in terms of purchasing power parity on the GDP scale to number 4. And in the process, Russia established relationships with China in a way that it never had before. Back in 1972, well before you were born, I was graduating high school then. Richard Nixon, at the insistence of Henry Kissinger, went to China, cut a deal with the Chinese at the time, where we accepted the one China policy, which meant we accepted Taiwan as part of China, and we formed an economic relationship with the Chinese for the express purpose of pitting the Chinese against the Russians. We wanted to keep the Chinese and Russians apart because, it was like that scene from Ghostbusters where you got Rick Moranis and Sigourney Weaver, and Harold Ramis has said, we got to keep these two apart because if they get together, it's going to be the end of the world. Well, that was sort of, Russia was Rick Moranis and China was Sigourney Weaver. And lo and behold, what did we do as a result of our sanctions and attempt to punish Russia? We pushed them together so that now you got Russia and China in an alliance that's economic, that's military, that's political, and that's going to change the international, and it's already in the process of changing the international economic order. The United States used to, until recently, controlled it by virtue of the US dollar being the reserve currency. That's over, baby. That's done. You've got nations lining up to become part of BRICS. Now, BRICS is still trying to work out an international currency system The odds are it's going to be partly gold based, but also partly local, the native currencies. But they're coming up with an alternative to the point that countries that used to pay for oil in dollars are not doing so anymore. Saudi Arabia has told the United States, no, we're not going to. Everything we sell is not going to be sold in dollars. So what we've seen is the U.S. failure to control the situation in Ukraine. Its actions against Russia and China have weakened the United States to the point that our control over this international rules-based order is going away. The days of the U.S. as an empire are coming to an end.
Do you think that there is any off-ramp for the U.S. empire, or is this an inevitable collapse?
Yeah, it's an inevitable collapse. Look, when you've got actual scientists claiming that transgender is real, as far as, oh yeah, no, men can be women and women can be men. I mean, for God's sake, that's a mental illness. There's biology, there's hard science on it. Well, when you have a society that indulges in complete delusions and accepts them as if they're true, it's both a degradation of the culture and it's a descent into deviant behavior, because that kind of behavior does not promote the birth and nurturing of children. And then you look at what's happening in our major cities. They are crime ridden to extents that they've really without precedent in our history. So it is, we're sort of following a path that the Roman Empire took and the Greek Empire took and the Babylonian Empire took. Hey, and the British Empire, it's on its way out. I don't see an off ramp, because right now, can you imagine any politician that stands up and tries to make the case, hey, we need to stop supplying Ukraine. We need to work out a peace arrangement with the Russians. They're immediately going to be accused of being sellouts to Putin, puppets of Putin. You're under Putin's thumb. Because, what the nasty secret is, why are we involved with all these wars? Because the wars make these military industrial complex, the corporations, wealthy, and their shareholders wealthy. Hardly any Americans die in these stupid affairs. We lost a few in Afghanistan, a few in Iraq. Nothing really that made a difference to the people whose loved ones died. But in terms of actual loss of life, hell, it was about we lost as many in the entire war in Iraq as you lose in 1 month in traffic accidents in the United States. Okay, so war's good business, and that's one of the reasons you keep seeing the defense budget creep up. It's now approaching $890 billion, and what do you get for that? Hey, you get $100 million F-35 jet that's only 29% operationally ready. The other 71% is sitting in the hangar, can't fly. But you paid a good amount of money for it. And so, I mean, it's just across the board. It's a level of corporate corruption aided and abetted by people in Congress who've sold their souls to the company store.
So, Larry, we are fast approaching time. If people want to find more of your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
My primary platform is sonar21.com. I have all the connections and links there to YouTube, Rumble, BitChute channels as well, and ways that people can support me if they want to.
As far as my stuff, you can find the Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can also support our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. Highly recommend that service. JD is a close friend of mine, and I enjoy working with him greatly. And remember, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.